Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 26th episode of our Navigating Turbulent Times series. Obviously, our episodes to date have been tackling COVID and the impact on workplace and facilities management, not only from a UK perspective, but also from an international perspective. As you can see today, a title of our webinar is COVID-19, the International Perspective, Part 2. This follows on from the episode 11 for those savvy people that are keeping up to date with the numbers on an episode we conducted back in June. That really is following on from the perspective of what's happened from an international perspective in terms of COVID. So we're going to look at areas across the globe with our respective panel today in terms of what's changed, what's different, perceptions, maybe potential forecasts as well, but that's always dangerous. But from that point of view, we want an engaging webinar today. We've got a great panel, and also from that perspective we do have a Q&A session as well, so we would invite as many of your questions to come through and we will take them as we go along. So I'm Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight at the IWFM. Many of you have probably heard or seen me on these webinars. And once again, for those that did join our episode 11, unfortunately, we can't have Wally, our chair from our Nigerian committee, on today's webinar. Due to the events in Nigeria, Wally is fine. I don't want to put anyone worried, but from a business point of view, she couldn't make today. So Sarah's kindly going to be a panelist today, which is very different to being the chair. So Sarah, you're going to have a different view of the world today, I'm sure. So I will be kind, and please don't judge my host because yours is excellent, by the way. So there you go. So before we move on, I think I would love to introduce the panelists, but what I tend to do here is, rather than read off a long list of bios and then realise you're 20 minutes into the webinar and this is an hour episode, is that I like to just go across the screen there as we see it and start off with you, Nigel, in respect to from how's this impacted you generally, and from the discussion we had back in June, what essentially has changed from you? So a nice little introduction about yourself, and also just a little bit of a flow to get you started almost around what's changed since we met back in June, which was episode 11. So Nigel, if you could kick off, and then we go across the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for inviting me back for these discussions. My name, as you can see, is Nigel Luke. I've been in facilities now for most of my career. I've worked internationally for over 15 years in different roles. Currently, I'm the Global Head of Property and Facilities at CDC Group. What's changed? In some respects, not a lot, to be honest with you, internationally. Depending on where you are in the world, the lockdowns have come, they've gone, they've come back. We, shortly after our last webinar, we opened our South African office to only close it again a week later because of the COVID situation. But we've pressed on, actually, as a company. We've actually done a fit out of a new office in Bangalore during the COVID situation, and that was challenging, as you can expect, but we completed that on time and within budget. But in other situations, we've put on hold any new offices that we may have had elsewhere, particularly in Africa. And we've seen, I guess, the economic impact taking hold now, not just in the UK, but also internationally. And it really depends on where you are in the world, on what stage of lockdown these countries might be at. For instance, we've seen spikes in Egypt, but the country isn't closing down. Economically, they just couldn't afford to. So it's how we operate with our partners there to keep the business going, working from home. And the duty of care and the health and well-being of our employees is actually at the forefront of everything we do. So what's changed? Again, I think we've just continued to operate the business from remote working. The IT infrastructure, as we talked about in some depth last time, has really taken the forefront of what we do and how we do it. And the collaboration internationally with our international colleagues is actually a lot better than what it probably was this time last year. We've been forced into being able to speak to them and see them on webinars and also on conference calls, probably more so than we have ever done before. And that's something I think that we're going to continue to examine and explore on how we can enhance that connectivity and collaboration, even across borders.
No, thank you, Nigel. And I think from some of those points you've raised there, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into some of those points today. So, Gordon, introduction from your dear self, and also just remind you of the question, but it's short, but probably quite relevant. Is what's changed since we discussed episode 11 back in June?
Okay, it's actually Stan that's here, not Gordon, but
okay. Stan. Sorry, Stan. Sorry, Stan Mitchell. Sorry, I know Gordon Mitchell very well as well.
Yeah. No, this is the good-looking one, so don't worry about it. Funnily enough, well, first of all, who am I? Because some of the people, I guess, won't know who I am. I'm Stan Mitchell from a company called Key Facilities Management International, and we are actually enjoying our 30th year anniversary in the UK this year. So we've been around almost as long as FM's been around in terms of a UK perspective. And we are very much developing the business currently internationally. And I'm very interested in what Nigel has just said, because we've just business as usual. We've just launched a new legal entity in Kenya. We are also mobilizing a new client in Egypt right now. And we've just consolidated new legal entities in the Middle East, in a couple of countries in the Middle East. So business goes on. And in FM, that's very, very true, I think, for everybody that potentially is on listening to this webinar, because whether it's COVID related or not, we as FM people are at the front line of dealing with the impact of COVID, or as a minimum maintaining the facilities that we're responsible for, etc. And I have to say, as a company, I honestly believe we've never been busier than we have been in the last 9-12 months period. And we don't see that slowing down anytime soon. The only thing that's been changing for us is the travel. The ability for the cross-border travel is severely now restricted. And again, I would repeat what Nigel said, what's changed since June? Not a lot. I think back in June, we were all talking about the second wave. So at that point in time, it was an opportunity for us within the FM sector to think ahead and think about not getting caught short, as many of us were when the pandemic first hit us, and preparing for the second wave. And that certainly is the case. And we're in England right now, tomorrow, I believe it's a complete lockdown. It's slightly different in Scotland where I live, but in the many parts of the world, in different countries, as I said, I think back in June, we're trying to deal with different strategies from different governments in different countries, from different clients, in terms of where you work for them, and Key as a company works in about 21 countries at the moment. So in every client, although it might be the same country, clients have different approaches and strategies that you have to be cognizant of, because at the end of the day, we're there to serve them. So it's their call as to how they want us to deal with the current pandemic and beyond. But it's our responsibility as the professionals, if you like, to give best advice. And whether the companies follow that advice or not is another story. And then what we find is, even within the same client organizations in different countries, different MDs, they will have their own ideas about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So for us right now, it is about trying to keep track, and literally that's what we're doing. We've got trackers running for different clients in different countries, because it's does become very, very confusing. And in terms of leadership, as we've seen in government, it's very easy to give the wrong advice that might not be strictly accurate, and that's very, very important that we give the right advice, and most of all that we look after and protect our people, subject to local government, country restrictions, etc. So yes, repeating what Nigel said, not a lot has changed, but what has changed is the maturity of our processes and procedures. So I think 6 months on, 7 months on, we kind of know what we should be doing. We've already probably, certainly in our case, taken the physical changes that we could make in terms of social distancing criteria, in terms of avoiding handling of public spaces, surfaces or handles, etc., etc. So I think for probably most of us on this call, we've kind of dealt with those physical, practical things, and now actually our focus has to become very, very pointed towards the mental well-being of our own people, because it's been a hard slog for a lot of these people. And some of them, in Egypt, for an example, one of our clients there, they've never shut the doors in the last 7 months. So, and they've actually had COVID impacts within the people in the building. So they give us 3 days to go and do a deep clean, and then it's everybody back at work. So you go from that extreme on one hand to other extremes where we've got clients that are telling their staff, we're not going to bring you back to the office until April next year. So what you need to do to support that kind of facility is something radically different than what we need to do to try and keep a facility that's still fully occupied safe in terms of the individuals, but also maintainability of the building and the fabric, etc., etc. So
that's great, Stan, and please pass my regards on to Gordon. So apologies for that. To Sarah, to bring you into the debate, and as for that, I guess is what's changed. I guess from your perspective, being based out in the UAE, I guess from an international perspective, and appreciate Nigel and Stan are based in the UK, but obviously with the overseas. What's changed for you in the 6 months, and how different is it over there at the moment?
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and hello everyone. Good afternoon to you all. Interestingly enough, it's actually very different here. Quite a bit has changed here. I'll start off just by saying, just purely season-wise, we're now entering the winter season. The last conversation that we had, I think it was around about 5-6 months ago. Obviously, we were sort of coming into the peak of the summer, and as you all know, it is extremely hot here, and we'll see temperatures that actually kind of go into the 50 degrees Celsius mark. Because of that, most people are indoors in the summer and outdoors in the winter, which is the opposite to what you're experiencing in Europe and actually most parts of the world. So a lot of the activities that are taking place now, you'll find that most people are outdoors. From a government perspective, it kind of puts their mind at ease somewhat, because they know that the transmission of COVID is going to be less likely during the winter season and it being outdoors. FM as an industry here has really been at the forefront, I'd say at least in the last 8 months. Particularly from sort of March onwards, when we started the government sanitization programs across the country. It's gained a lot more respect. FM over here hasn't matured as much as it has, or as it is really in Europe and other parts of the world. It's still a relatively new industry, which is still developing, but it's really kind of taken on a lot of traction since. And very widely respected in that sense. So we've got I think, Stan was mentioning, and also Nigel, there is actually quite a lot of business and a lot of work that is going on, because there is lots to do in terms of providing services for clients. Interestingly, from my perspective, just to let you all know what I've been doing lately, I've most recently been providing some consultancy and advisory services to a lot of the predominant GCC organizations here. And I've had some very interesting conversations without going into too much detail and breaching confidentiality with clients that are asset owners and are quite, what's the word, nervous, should you say, or in terms of what are they going to be doing with their assets, particularly their commercial assets. Because working from home has been extremely productive here, and it's been actually quite a big success. A lot of clients here are quite concerned of, you know, the long-term sort of outcome of their commercial assets. Will people be renewing their leases? Are you going to see office sizes reducing because it's not necessary to hold that many employees? So I've been doing some work behind the scenes, looking at, you know, from a strategic level, how can they repurpose those assets? And you know, where FM comes in to do that. So traditionally FM is the interface between industry and the end user, and we've been extremely active in this particular part of the world. Some of the other things that have changed since the last time we had this conversation is we've got a lot more restriction between the Emirates. So from Abu Dhabi and Dubai and all the other Emirates, there is a border across Abu Dhabi that is very restrictive. You need to have COVID tests to enter. It's actually a PCR test to come in, and then once you're actually in Abu Dhabi, you've got then within, I believe it's 6 days to do a swab test before you can basically come and go as you please. So that also has restricted a lot of movement. You'll tend to find there are a lot of people that work in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi but actually live in other Emirates. For the local population, they're mostly coming in from a lot of the northern Emirates, coming in for the week to work in Abu Dhabi and go back on a weekend. So that's caused a bit of a problem. And there's a lot of daily commuters that come in from Dubai and work in Abu Dhabi. So that's actually made a lot of changes to the working structure, hence the reason why a lot more people are working from home, hence the reason why asset owners are concerned about their commercial properties. And ultimately, you know, what is FM's kind of role here moving forward? So that's one of the key things that really has, I can see that has changed. But in terms of managing the COVID pandemic here, hats off to the UAE government. They really have done a phenomenal job. The restrictions are a lot tighter here, as I've just mentioned. Generally, you'll find that there is a far more genuine appreciation of authority and respect for authority here. So, you know, you kind of do as you're told happily. Face masks are mandatory. We've got laws that are in place that, for example, like, as I mentioned a little while ago, if you don't do the test when you come into Abu Dhabi within 6 days, you actually do get fined. And I know someone who actually was, I think, a day late on that test, and they were fined 5,000 dirhams. So because of the way that the smart government systems are all interconnected, everything's kind of captured on your Emirates ID. So your movements, they're captured, where you've been going, where you've been testing. The track and trace campaign here and the strategy here has been phenomenal. In terms of Dubai, and I mean, as most people know, Dubai heavily depends on tourism, Abu Dhabi not so much. So Dubai is actually open. There's nothing that's closed in Dubai. But before people enter Dubai, they have to have a negative COVID test. And if they do test positive, particularly, you know, sometimes randomly they get stopped at the airport, they have these tags in place where they're asked to quarantine and so on and so forth. You know, when you consider the population of the UAE, it's a very similar population to London. So, you know, it's in a very vast, so it's not a concentrated, you know, population in one particular place. You can then argue that it's easier to control and maintain and then basically put levels in terms of the pandemic. We don't have as many cases. I think recently we've had a bit of a surge. We're kind of averaging on around about 1,400 a day, but the death rate here has been extremely low, and I think that's purely down to the fact that, you know, the kind of comprehensive approach and strategy that the government's put forward, of which FM has been heavily involved, has actually been working very well. So we're more on the flip side. We haven't really had a second wave. We're kind of waving the first wave, if that makes sense. It's a prolonged wave, but because of the season and the climate change, hopefully we'll start to see those numbers come down a little bit more, and some tension be released from all the FM services in terms of, you know, the just sheer manpower and headache and stress and efforts that were going in over the past sort of 8 months or so. So a bit of a flip side to what Nigel and Stan are experiencing, I guess.
And I think that's in some ways the disadvantage or advantages with the different methods that certain countries have used when it comes to track and trace, as you've used examples there. But Nigel, Stan, I'd like to bring you that because there's a nice follow-up question that I did have, Sarah, in terms of when you work across borders. I know you've mentioned, Stan and Nigel, respectively, countries of Singapore and Egypt. How's that experience there, particularly with those countries? And I know Singapore stood out in terms of how it's handled COVID from a case perspective, but I guess where there's, Nigel, from your perspective, you mentioned there's some growth within those areas in terms of offices. What lessons can we learn from there? And is it just simply how they conducted the track and trace, or does it go deeper than that?
I think it goes slightly deeper than that. As I mentioned previously, Peter, I think that, you know, you have to understand the economics of the individual countries as well. Some countries are in a position to be able to instruct and close down their businesses, and you know, as the UK are. But even the UK, we already know that the impact economically is going to be challenging for the government going forward. But in some of these other countries, they just couldn't afford to close the lights out and shut the doors. So as Stan mentioned, balancing business with that type of spike is very challenging. I think Stan hit the nail on the head where you have to put your people first. As an organization, I think one thing we've learned, and we've always known it at CDC and elsewhere I've worked, is that people are your main asset, and you make sure that they are looked after, the well-being of those individuals are put to the forefront. And I think the COVID situation has really tested companies to stand up to those values. And I'm proud to say that CDC and other companies I work with are absolutely standing to the forefront of that and making sure that they are safe working from home and business can go forward. And just to touch very quickly on what Sarah said, the productivity of those individuals working from home has made companies think about what do we do with our office spaces, not just in London, but overseas as well. And I think we can come back to that question a little later on. But the individual spikes, some countries are actually probably seeing a third wave now, because the UK is behind the curve a little bit. We're just entering a second wave. We're very much into a second wave now. But when you look at Europe, they had it about 4 weeks ago. But when you look at Asia, they've had cases where they're now looking at a third wave. And at every single stage, not just FM, but other sectors are learning from the experiences of the past one, thankfully. And we are getting better. The death rates are low around the world because of what we learned in the first wave. But actually, there's other economic challenges that are coming in place. We mentioned earlier that we can't be joined by a colleague from Nigeria this morning because there's unrest there now. And I think that that's also part of what FM does, making sure that the property and the environment that we're working from is secure. And that might even extend to you don't travel, even if there's no spike, if you've got unrest in the country. And some of these other countries are probably seeing those challenges now, particularly in Africa, but other places in the world as well. Singapore is fortunate where that economically they are sound, and very much like the UAE, the government are quite forceful and people happily do as they're told. I don't think that's the case elsewhere in the world.
And Stan, I guess from and this was discussed on episode 11 about the role international standards has to play in this, is how do you foresee that going? I know there's active work already happening, but it'd be good to know what the role international standards has to play around this as well.
Yes, indeed. It's, we haven't been slow in picking up the potential of standards to help us as facilities management professionals. We did a bit of a survey on some of the organisations, the FM organisations that had already complied with ISO 41001, which is the management system standard. And within that standard, one of the areas that you focus upon in order to comply with it is risk management. And several of the organisations that had gone through that process before COVID appeared fed back to us that they were definitely felt they were much better prepared when COVID did hit, because they had gone through that journey around compliance with that management system standard. So that was very good news from our point of view, that at least for some of those FM teams who had gone on that journey, they got almost an instant dividend and payback for it. But what we're currently doing within the ISO Standards Committee is two things that are relevant to how we continue to manage the situation going forward. One is we're working on ISO 41016, which is about technology in FM. And we're hoping to publish that this next year, where it will be a technical report trying to help facilities managers about how they should go about identifying and leveraging technology to give a real advantage in how tech as a tool can help us in the FM space. And it's things like today already, we're harnessing technology to manage social distancing, to identify environmental conditions, etc., and give us real information rather than perception about what we need to do to make the workplace safer and to manage it on an ongoing basis, so that people can occupy that retail space that Sarah was talking about, that's going to become a problem for the asset owners. And the last comment I would make is we have just launched, literally last month now, a new standard which will be ISO 41017, which is about the management of pandemics in the workplace. So what we've decided to do, we might not get great advantage out of this because standards take a few years to develop and publish, but at least when COVID-20 comes along, as it inevitably will, because this is called COVID-19 because it's the 19th pandemic that's happened in the world. So at least what we can do for the future is get all the knowledge and experience that we are all gaining right now in how to manage proactively and prepare a standard for those that will follow, and be much, much better prepared when the next pandemic comes along. Hopefully it won't affect anybody on this call, but at least we're trying to help future-proof FM and its contribution to economies, etc. And interestingly, it's being led. The convener for that standard is from China.
And it's good to hear from the international standards perspective that's work in progress, and obviously with some standards actually launched. I guess I've got a question here that you've mentioned already, Nigel, and all of you to a degree, around the importance of people, and the word collaboration has already come out. The question is targeted more about your teams and how you've kept that work ethic and the mental well-being side of things going. But I like to just twist the question a little bit, if you don't mind, is actually personally, how have you done it for yourself? Because again, it's good talking about teams, but actively with your lovely faces on the screen, it'd be good from a personal perspective. How have you kept that motivation going in the turbulent times that we're facing, not only from a personal perspective in some cases, but also from a work perspective? So I don't know who wants to kick off on that, but it'd be good to just get it from your personal perspective. And the main question on that is, what's the biggest barrier you've had to overcome in the period since March?
I think discipline. I use one word really. How have I kept myself sane? It's very easy. I'm benefiting from not having to commute into London every day. It's saving me a few hours a day doing that. But naturally, in March, you get up in the morning, you go straight to your computer, and you find you're working probably 12, 14 hours a day because you don't have that commute. So very quickly, I realized that wasn't sustainable, and discipline. So you get up in the morning, you absolutely do 6 or 7 things that people tell you to do: read a page of a book, go for a walk, make yourself a coffee, get some of your own time, and then you start work at the normal time you would and finish on time. I think that's important, because I realized also, with me working probably till 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, I send emails, people are going to read them. You know, technology is fantastic, but it means that you've always got your email with you in your back pocket, and people read them. That's very unfair on your team. So we had a team discussion about making sure that we went back to our core values, and discipline was one of them. You start on time, you finish on time, you give 100% during those hours. And for me, managing teams across borders, I'm very fortunate. I've done it for a few years now, and I've never really had a team with me at any one time. They've always been located around the world, so it was always about reaching out to them. And again, that's discipline. Make sure I reached out to them every single day just to see how they were, see how their families were, see how their friends were, because if someone caught COVID, even if it's a close friend, it might impact on how they're feeling for the day. So just be a bit more understanding. And I mentioned last time on this call that the way we measure success now has changed. I think one thing that has changed, and that is you measure the output rather than the hours that people work or what they do during those hours. So I think that's very important, because someone might say, like, I need tomorrow, I need to go and see my mum, or I need to go drop some flowers off. That's absolutely fine. And I think that understanding as a leader and a manager, I think that's come to the forefront as well. So there we are, discipline all round, really.
No, thank you, Nigel, and that's always a good thing to have. So who wants to come in next on that from a personal perspective and your team's perspective?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up if I may. Obviously, I'm not actually directly looking after teams at the moment, but I am giving a lot of advice and kind of, if you like, some strategy perspectives to some of the organizations over here. One of the challenges that companies, FM companies particularly, have been having here are a lot of the if you like, you know, staff that are working on the front line have actually contracted COVID. And the accommodation situation here is very different to other parts of the world, particularly in Europe. So they are all housed in these accommodation blocks, and managing the non-spread of the virus there has been extremely challenging. How to motivate the staff that have actually got to go out to work, and then from office staff that are working from home, how can we get them to be the most productive? Because a lot of people there, because obviously kids are off at school, they're doing online learning at home. It's very, very hectic. And what we found to be really productive and had very good feedback from was basically, just as Nigel mentioned, you know, just showing motivation, dedication, showing care to your staff. Because in FM, 100% absolutely agree with Nigel when he earlier said that, you know, our people are our greatest asset, and that can't be truer. So what we decided to do for 3 of the organizations was actually develop some kind of framework, if you like, particularly for the staff that were working from home, where they would have meetings scheduled at a particular time to allow for, you know, online learning, to allow for small kids to have, you know, their breakfast, bottles, whatever it is that they need to do. So they would have these meetings scheduled at a particular time. They would ask the employee what best suits them. They'd allow people to actually work shift and flexi times. So, you know, Nigel mentioned sending an email at like 6, 7 o'clock in the evening for some people is not going to be good, because they will read it and they're going to have to reply, and that's taken away from their private time. But they had actually developed some teams within teams that would work particular hours because it would best suit them. And it proved to be very, very successful. And as for the staff that are working the front lines and are actually in the accommodation, some of them unfortunately having contracted COVID, just getting a simple call from your managing director or your CEO, you know, something like that, just to let them know that you're thinking of them and wishing them well, you'll be surprised the impact that it has. A bunch of flowers, you know, when they come back from the hospital, box of chocolates, something very kind of minimal in terms of a gesture, it does really go a long, long way. And we've seen some great positive results come out of it. And I think at this time particularly, you've just got to be very inventive, if you like, you know, in terms of the approaches and the ideas that you have, and just really engage with your staff and with your employees and find out what best works for them. We did find that a lot of people were quite reluctant to really be honest about what would help them. But I think once you break down those barriers and really develop a foundation of trust, and you know, ultimately their success is going to be the company's success. just to try and find some kind of common connection, just to get to motivate them to basically be as productive as they possibly can. And I've seen it work really, really well.
And Sarah, do you think that's here to stay then? Is there a problem that when things go back to the new normal, which is a phrase that I'm not particularly keen on, I think we should be aspiring to be more than normal. Is there a danger that we may slip back into old habits? So you mentioned there about structure frameworks. Do you think this is here to stay? So it sort of links to a question that I'd like to get Stan involved in as well. But first, Sarah, your viewpoint. Is this something that's going to last beyond the pandemic?
I think it's something that now that it's been tried and tested and people are comfortable with, will be given a choice. You know, I'm a firm believer. I actually like the environment, to engage with people, being in an office. You know, some people thrive off of that. Some other people work much better alone at home. And I think what's going to be happening now is that people are going to be given a choice. Obviously, depending on their job, on their role, their responsibilities, and what they need to do on a daily basis. But you may find that people with kids might prefer actually working from home on particular days of the week, let's say. I think with the advances in technology, I mean, just to give you an idea here, schools here at the moment are partly open, meaning that parents have a choice. So you can either send your kids to school, or you can give them online learning, or you can give them both. And it's actually been working quite well from some of the parents that I've been speaking to. And I just think it's kind of opened up the options in terms of how the new workplace is going to look. I don't think it's going to be either you work from home or you work at the office. I think it might be a kind of balance of the two, where there's going to be a lot more agility, there's going to be a lot more flexibility, and to try and get as much productivity out of people. Because there's a few other benefits that we haven't actually spoken about. I mean, we also need to look at the environment impact, the sustainability impact. You know, Nigel mentioned that he hasn't been commuting as much, and he's not alone. There's, you know, when you take into account the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have not been doing the same, it's had a huge impact on, you know, the environment. And if we all remember, a few months ago, we had kind of wildlife out in the urban areas, and we hadn't seen that. Like, there were flocks of, I think, deer, was it in Wales or something? I remember seeing. There's all this kind of like all this wildlife that's coming back into, you know, into the urban areas that were not seen before. Obviously, from an environmental perspective, it's a lot better. Sustainability perspective, it is a lot better. So there's so many other benefits to it, where, you know, a lot of companies can also look at it from their CSR perspective and say, well, you know, we're actually contributing here to environmentalism, to sustainability, by actually taking these measures. I think it's going to be, it's not going to be a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. I think it's going to be very heavily dependent on the particular company, what their business model is. A lot of companies that have, you know, multinationals and working all over the world will probably hugely benefit from it. But yeah, I do think this is going to be a new norm, a next norm. I think is one of the terms that Stan likes to use. But yeah, I think it's something we're going to be getting used to.
So Stan, echoing that term then, what's your view on that? Are some of those issues here to stay post-pandemic?
Yeah, you asked at the beginning about how has it affected us as individuals. I do believe it's the next norm, and it's going to keep changing. This pandemic isn't finished by any means, so who knows what's coming next. And all we can do in an FM context is be as prepared as we can be. But you know, my one word would be communication. Is what I've learned. Now, I've always been an advocate that within FM, communication is absolutely business critical, because we serve so many masters in FM in any context, and you've got to understand who those masters are and condition your communication accordingly to who you're communicating with. The thing I've learned, so whilst I've always advocated communication very proactively, what the pandemic has done for me personally is I've talked with all of the people within key facilities management more than I've ever communicated with. And why? Because I became very conscious that I didn't want anybody to think that I wasn't interested as the CEO of the company. Whereas in the past, I think that's the role of the line manager, whoever the line manager might be. And the line manager probably doesn't want me sticking my nose into too many communications. But now in the pandemic situation, I started inviting myself into all of the team meetings. I've met every employee's children, every employee's dog, cat, rabbit, whatever it might be. And that has gone down extremely well. Just to say, you know, I am interested. How are you getting on? Never mind the company, never mind the clients. You know, how are you bearing up to all of this? And be aware we're available. You know, we're here as the backstop to try and make sure that we can, as a team in the whole, that we're still able to go and deliver what we're all getting paid for to deliver as an outsourcing company or as an advisory organisation or whatever it might be. So for me, the other thing I would like to mention in terms of leadership, because we have not been able to travel, what this has done is turned some of our leadership strategies on its head. We can't go and help and guide physically now with our teams that are in disparate countries around the world. So we're having to communicate in a different way and encourage them to step up. And I'm a great half glass full person, and I think that for me and my organization is a fantastic positive, because a lot of these people probably would never have stepped up quite so much if we had arrived and offered support, etc. So we've seen some individuals really shine in this situation where they've taken on their own leadership roles and they've been proactive in what they've tried to do. So for me, I'm always a believer in every negative there's a positive, and I think that's one of the biggest positives that I've experienced.
No, that's great.
I just want to say, Peter, if I could, just coming very quickly, I totally support Stan there. I think we've always, as an organisation, maybe have been a bit London-centric, but because we can't travel, we had to put trust in others with the skill base. And I think we've encouraged them to show that skill base, and for them, the communication's got a lot better, and actually the results are just as good if we had spent money travelling across borders to go and see them. So the communication is key, and what I totally support Stan, working across borders, putting trust in others has really come to the forefront.
No, thank you. And I think from that point of view, we've got a couple more questions from myself, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A. So we'd encourage listeners, viewers to send your questions in, and we are getting some through as I speak. So that would be good. But obviously, from the perspective of IWFM, obviously representing facilities management and workplace professionals across the UK and the world. Obviously, we've done our IWFM awards, and this is a subtle plug for that, where we did look at the COVID awards, and those entries were really inspiring because they were voted by the public and really brought in some of the social value, the well-being aspects that we've discussed in terms of the role of FM. But has there been a change in shift of expectations of FM teams because of this? Because we've heard phrases before like the Cinderella profession, the secret army that no one knows about. They only know when something goes wrong. And some of our episodes have highlighted, as you mentioned, Sarah, earlier, tales from the front line, actually people that have been at the front line where work didn't stop and their risk of contracting COVID, I'm afraid, was probably higher than most because they're literally in certain workplaces and spaces, such as hospitals, schools and various other areas where it might be slightly higher than other areas rather than just office buildings. So has there been a shift in the FM teams? And I'll open that to the floor really, just to say, is there a shift, but more importantly, is it a shift that's going to maintain?
I think Sarah touched a base on it earlier, actually. I think the spotlight on FM has been at the forefront during this COVID. But I honestly believe that we've now, as a team, and I can only speak for our team, have become trusted advisors to the business. And I think that is going to stay. I mean, we're now able to advise the board. We're actually taking advice, and that they're saying, well, if you think it's going to work, let's do it. They're now asking us about our strategy for the next 5 years. How does that impact on the property market? And also looking us to lead more rather than being told what to do and when to do it. So I think the trusted advisor piece has really come to the forefront. Very proud of the team that I manage at the moment, lead, and they've done that. And I think it's because of all the hard work they've done through the COVID to make the place COVID secure, and what they've done and think ahead.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? I mean, yeah, I mean, I agree with Nigel 100%. I mean, here in the UAE, FM is obviously a less mature profession as it is in other parts of the world. But traditionally, it was a very, and still is in some aspects, a very client-driven business where, you know, the client kind of tells you what you're supposed to do, as opposed to FM taking the lead and saying, look, you know, we're the FM experts, and you know, we've actually been hired so that we can manage your assets for you, and this is what we want to do. So the kind of approach to FM has been a little bit operations and maintenance focused. Post pandemic, or you know, since the actual start of the pandemic, it's completely changed here. As Nigel mentioned, the trust factor has gone completely through the roof, and that's purely been driven by the way FM companies have managed to respond to the needs of their clients. They've been, you know, in terms of the turning around services in very tight times, getting staff out, you know, mobilizing huge numbers of manpower, carrying out some really heavy, particularly sanitization in, you know, for the government. They've managed to do it in a fantastic job. And now you've got companies actually now kind of looking at FM for what it really is and coming to FM companies with, you know, these are our issues, these are the problems that we're having, please give us the solution. So there's always an opportunity, and there's always a positive, you know, unfortunately in this very bad negative, but for this part of the world, it's actually been really shined a light on FM, where we've been able to flourish and actually let people know this is what we are here to do. We're here to manage unfortunate situations such as this, as well as the good times. So from my perspective, yeah, that's what we're experiencing over here.
Oh, that's great. And I guess from that perspective, you mentioned an element of skills and how it's shone a light on skills that, particularly around communication. But can I be devil's advocate? Has it shone the light on skills that aren't there? Is there future skills needed, particularly for the sector, not on relating to the pandemic, but some issues that were pre-COVID around tech, future of work? It'd be good to know, obviously from a positive side, you've seen what skills are there, but what about future skills?
Yeah, some of the skills that it has, or the lack of skills, should I say, that it's exposed is predominantly around tech, because the UAE is very strong on technology, and you know, we have really what is available to us is probably world-class technology. It's absolutely fantastic, but it's not utilized. And that doesn't just go as far as, you know, the FM companies, it's actually across the board. But where FM companies come into play, the superb technologies that are available to them, they don't actually use to their full potential. And this is now what's been exposed sort of, you know, during and post the beginning of the pandemic. So what is the response? Obviously training. We need to look at what aspects aren't being utilized, why aren't they being utilized? And a lot of that, again, you know, Stan mentioned it earlier on, comes down to communication. It's not being communicated to them. So, you know, it's just like if you give someone a brand new car with all of these kind of wonderful, you know, gadgets and everything, but you don't show them how to use it, they're just not going to use it, because a car is really there just to get you from A to B. All of the luxury and, you know, all of the fancy stuff in between, not many people know how to use it unless they've actually been shown how to do it. And the same thing applies to the technology that we've adopted here. So we've seen that we need to focus a lot more on that, on training. We need to focus a lot more in terms of, you know, getting people out there, you know, supervisors, manager skills, leadership skills, because a lot of teams have actually been left to fend for themselves, if you like, because of, you know, the huge amount of work and pressure that's come onto FM. You've got people, but managing people that were not necessarily doing so before. And it's just really down to communication and having a structured plan on how we're able to do that. And I am happy to say that, particularly over, I'd say, the last 3 months, it has actually improved hugely. So FM companies have actually taken, you know, the interest to actually reinvest back into their companies and get their people trained up, so that they are able to use them to their full potential.
No, thank you. And that echoes some of the questions that have been coming in. And I'd like to go on to questions. And some of it has been, I've tried to wrap it up into a theme around skills. But particularly got an interesting question from Charlotte, and I'll get your thinking capped on, folks. Thank you, Charlotte, for your question. It's about we're continuing to fit out our new office spaces for the future now. Coming from a business that is fortunate to still be going through high growth. If we don't expand our spaces now, when we'll be able to return, we won't have enough capacity regardless of social distancing. Yet we run the risk of these spaces remaining empty for an unknown time frame. So I guess that's a position which some companies may be in about high growth. Is there any advice from the panel that we could give Charlotte around, I guess it's a predicament, but probably a good predicament to be in when you're talking about high growth, when a lot of other companies are probably going through the polite words of business transformation?
I would say, oh, sorry, go on, Stan, carry on.
Yeah, I was just going to give the rest of you a breather. The only thing I would say, and by the way, I've always said it, nothing to do with COVID, is flexibility. Keep it simple. Keep it completely flexible, because today in any environment there are very good interim solutions in terms of breaking space up. You've got to try and counter the traditional manager or director who wants his fiefdom to be totally enclosed and nobody else can come in when he doesn't want them to come in. I worked for a very, very innovative CEO about 40 years ago, who had a completely open plan environment, and nobody, and he led by example, nobody had an office. Now, when we had to change the requirements of that particular organisation on several occasions, it was simple, it was easy. And that would be my advice to anybody configuring a new workspace, is keep it simple. And if you configure the space to suit the ever-changing needs of the organisation, because that's the only constant, there are plenty of ways of doing that in a very flexible and cost-effective manner.
No, thank you, Stan. This is the joy of keeping an open forum, but did anyone else want to follow on Stan's response?
I think we both do. Do you mind if I just jump in, Nigel? Just very quickly. I'll tell you, I mean, obviously it depends on the size of the office and how many people and you know, the purpose and all the rest of it. But one particular office that I've recently done some work on, we were looking at how to repurpose some of the size. And they have actually decided to put in like a day creche for their office staff. And the purpose of this is, I mean, again, there are some legalities behind it depending on whereabouts in the world you are, but the purpose behind it is to offer daycare that is affordable to their staff. Parents that are able to use that facility have, you know, peace of mind, because obviously their children are a lot closer. They pay a subsidized fee because they're, you know, it's within their company. And then another part of the office, they've decided to actually turn into sort of like a mini cafeteria, because it's quite far away from a location where there's a lot of restaurants. And what they're trying to do is actually generate some income, you know, from the overall size of the office. So there are some things that can be done, again, depending on the size of the office. You know, Stan made a very good point. It's not necessary really for everyone to have their own individual space, especially if you're going to have options where people can be flexible from working from home. And also, how are you going to be able to implement your social distancing strategy if you're not going to necessarily social distance forever? Having said that, I genuinely do think that, you know, we actually have to learn to live with the COVID-19 for quite some time. I don't think it's going to be something that kind of breezes away in the year 2001. A lot of people are quite optimistic about when a vaccine comes out will probably be the end of it, but logistically, looking at getting everyone having a vaccination around the world is just, first of all, a very huge task, and second of all, you know, do people trust it enough to actually, you know, willingly want to have a vaccine? So my plans are actually from around about 2023, where I genuinely think we will have to be living in a best possible way as we can with this COVID virus. So we have to look at innovative ways. How can we repurpose our spaces? How can we get people working, you know, productively and effectively, and trying to keep everyone as happy as possible? It's a juggling act, but you know, that's what FM's here for. That's we, you know, we find solutions to problems.
I would only add, totally agree with all those comments. To Stan's point, flexibility, agile working. Look at the workplace in itself. The one thing that everyone is telling me, our own employees, but other networks, the collaboration piece is missing. This is what people's miss, is the getting together with people. So you're talking to a man that signed the lease in March, a week before lockdown. Yes, I know, for a new space on the 6th floor of where we are. But actually that space now, we're looking at that very differently. It's not going to have the traditional workstations. We're buying furniture on casters. We can move whiteboards around. We can move dividers around. We're going to open the space up so teams can get together, social distancing, and then ability to come back together more closely once COVID's over. So the workplace, the flexibility of what you're using that space for. Don't forget, sorry, the lady's name that asked a question, I forgot her name, but
Charlotte. It was Charlotte.
Charlotte, look at it for how can you get your people together, collaborative space, ability also to work in the office alone if should you. So we're looking at pods on casters that you can sit in there, you can put your headphones on, you can do a piece of work in the workplace environments rather than sitting at home. So I think that there's a lot of people struggling working from home. We mustn't forget that. Some of us are very fortunate, some aren't. And the ability to go somewhere that they can just continue working, make that space as comfortable as possible.
Yeah, thank you. And we've had a couple of questions come in, and I'm aware of time. We try and get as many of these across to the panelists after. But thank you, Mark, and others. So we could rattle off your names. But from the perspective around supply chain issues, and I think it touched upon, Sarah, your point about across borders and the different constraints that might bring, is that it might be an obvious question, but has there been major issues around the supply chain? And I think it echoed the point about not the need for transport, but obviously for the supply chain perspective, there will be a need for transport from the air, if we look at air transportation, for example. So has there been any major concerns with your clients around the supply chain at the moment?
At the moment, a lot less. Initially, yes, because what we found was most of the major suppliers were pretty much supplying everybody. So we didn't have that many to choose from. And of course, the routes coming into the country were all being utilized by these very few suppliers that are out there. In terms of logistics, again, a very great initiative with the way that the government's managed all of this. Logistic companies, you know, anything that requires cross sort of border controls and travel has been looked after very well. They have permits, they have, you know, depending on what it is that they're carrying, they have special permits, they have special regulations and procedures that they have to follow that are separate to everybody else. So from that perspective, it is being managed very well. I just think for the first few months, because there was such a scare to really get, you know, whatever was required, again, there wasn't the actual cash to pay those supplies. So we had a kind of backlog that has now been cleared up. But the government actually has implemented regulations and in some cases laws that actually state that they pledge for us not to have shortfalls in anything, and one of those is food and medicine. So, you know, it's been managed very, very well from a very high perspective. From an FM's perspective, now things have calmed down, have kind of eased into it. Again, now that you know, things have opened up and companies are actually getting back into the swing of things, suppliers are a lot easier to manage in terms of that whole supply chain. So we've settled down back into it, and it's not a problem, or a slight problem, but not as much as it was a few months ago.
No, thank you. And anything to add, Nigel, Stan, from your perspective, obviously from a UK perspective, but also from some of your clients overseas, how has the supply chain issue been for you guys in your work?
A little bit more maturity, I think, has come to the forefront. Yes, we used to fly things from the UK abroad, but there are fantastic hubs in different regions. So while we're still flying things, they're flying a lot shorter distances. So, you know, we're exploring the agents of particular makers, where they are in the world, talking to them. And as I said, we finished a project off in Bangalore, and very grateful to my project manager that did that, because again, we were sourcing material more locally, but where we could, we flew at shorter distances, and that really helped. That helped the in-country supply chain as well. And we felt like we were giving something back to the regions by doing that. And that's something that we can continue exploring going forward.
That's great. And Stan, anything from your perspective around the supply chain issue, or not an issue, I guess?
No, that probably the biggest thing that we found, it's a different perspective on supply chain, was we had to make sure that all of our suppliers were intimately aware of the new standards that we were trying to implement in terms of visiting premises or undertaking their tasks within premises. So from our point of view, it was as much as making sure they were following those varying standards across those different client organizations, but also making sure that they were doing the right thing for their own people as well, in terms of coming into a different workspace. So it was just a logistical thing that we had to be on the front of, and making sure that we communicate. Communication keeps coming back into this discussion, but that's what it was all about, making sure that we had communicated adequately and we got the same back from our supply chain. And obviously, as Sarah had said, once you get over that peak of that kind of activity, everybody settles into the next norm.
Thank you. And I know we've had a load of questions, and this what naturally happens on webinars. We start and then the questions come through. Can only apologise for time, but we will send the questions on to the panelists. But I've got one final question from me, and it's a 30-second wrap up from each of you, and I haven't got a bell to ring, so I won't let you go beyond 30 seconds. But I guess from a second episode now around the global perspectives, and dare I say, there may be a third. We simply do not know, particularly with various things going on in the world as we speak, with the UK in lockdown from midnight tonight, election happening in one of the biggest powerhouses in the world. So we've avoided that question. We've avoided Brexit for some reason, but there may be questions coming in on that. But Sarah, I'll start with you. What's your takeaway learning, if you had to wrap up in 30 seconds, not to consolidate our two-hour episodes in 30 seconds, but anything you could feed back to the audience around lessons learned or lessons to learn?
I just think, I mean, there are so many lessons that have been learned, and still quite a few that we need to learn. But generally, for me, I strongly believe it's just a new reality that we have to get used to, and we have to really come together in terms of how we're going to approach this for the long term. It's not going to be over and done with within the next few months. Which is also actually the benefit of one of the sort of miracles, if you like, of the FM industry. This is what we do. You know, depending on the situation, we act accordingly, and that's really all that I want to say. I think it's something that you know, this pandemic is going to be around for a while. The new ways of working are going to be around for a while. I think, you know, communication, as Stan and both Nigel have mentioned, are absolutely key. The motivation and inspiration that we need to give to our teams is key. And I agree with Stan, even though we are, you know, we tend to use this term socially distanced. I genuinely don't think that we are socially distanced. We're just physically distanced, because we actually are a lot more involved with people that we work with, and we know more about their private and family lives than we did beforehand. So there is this sort of hidden intimacy that is happening amongst you know, the workforce and people that you're working alongside. And it's just a new thing that, guys, we're just going to have to basically grit our teeth and get used to it. And that's it really from my side. I think, like I said, put your plans in for the long term, and just do your best and take each day as it comes, because it's changing, as you all know. You know, lockdowns are happening again now in England. I believe from tomorrow. In my region, it's a lot different, so things are very much open, and things change all the time. So I think we just have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and then different lockdowns, I should add, within the UK. Thank you, Sarah. Stan, you mentioned earlier in your talk about getting to know your staff and particularly their pets. And Sarah's echoed that point around getting to know your staff and communication. Is there anything you would want to add in terms of lessons learned or lessons to learn going forward, as we've now done 2 episodes around global perspectives?
Yeah, I'm probably repeating myself. Stick to the top 3 priorities in FM, and that's communication, communication, and communication. It's and start with get your own house in order, get your people motivated, give them these opportunities that some of them will step up to and delegate their authorities. Give them. I worked for a management team a long time ago who encouraged people in FM to take risks. Now, that might seem a bit obscure to say to people. Don't take risks that puts anybody in danger or the organisation in danger, but take a risk to go beyond your comfort zone and see what the potential is. And for me, you talked earlier on, Peter, about skills. I don't think skills are the challenge. I think awareness of how to go and use the skills that you've already got probably is where you get the quickest and best return. And some people will surprise themselves, and that's certainly what we've found within our organisation, and that's to be learnt from a leadership point of view and encouraged in terms of motivating and supporting people to go and do this wonderful industry of ours and enjoy it, as well as face the challenges that we have to face.
Thank you, Stan. And last but not least, Nigel, from your perspective, you've heard the other 2 panellists. Is there anything you'd like to add on top of what you've already heard?
Probably just to add, really, and just to support what the guests have said, Sarah and Stan, communication absolutely key. I remember that to motivate your team, you have to be in a good place as well. So don't forget yourselves. Make sure that you are asking for help if you need it. There's nothing wrong with asking for help if you are struggling at all. Do speak to your teams. But most of all, just stand proud as facilities management. It's been a really tough time for everybody, but you should be all very proud of the work that you've done to help your organisation. So stand proud, be proud, and don't be afraid to take ideas forward with your leadership teams back in your workplaces.
No, thank you. And at this point, I want to say a massive thank you to you, Sarah, Stan and Nigel. You're looking well from we were a couple of months ago. And thank you for doing the 2nd episode in terms of the global perspectives. And dare I say it, we may be doing a 3rd, but that will maybe part of our programme moving forward. So thank you once again. And I've got a couple more slides just to finish off. Insight Hub, this is where you'll find all the information, including today's recorded episode, as you could see from the slip-ups from the host. Oh, that's me about names. This is live, so please pass the recording on to your clients, delegates that have missed today's episode. The Insight Hubs where you see research reports, good practice guides, guidance notes, content hubs, as well as these episodes. And also Nigel's now brought in a 4th panellist, and there you go. Always good to see. On a serious note, we've got COVID-19 information resource that will be regularly updated in light of what's going on. So please look out that as a resource on the IWFM website. So please go to that. As we mentioned, we love to hear from people that join these webinars, members, non-members, case studies around some of the issues you've heard today on our 26th episode, but the 25 that have been prior to this. As well as we've got a survey to go out to the listeners, viewers. So we do appreciate your feedback because it drives our episodes going forward. So we do ask for content ideas going forward for our episodes. And yeah, last but not least, I'd like to thank the viewers, listeners that have joined us today live. Again, thank you for sending your questions through. Again, this has been the second episode. God, what's happened since we've done the episode 11 in June? Again, things are changing. We do have episode 27 next week. It's part of Workplace Week, and it's going to tackle the subject of agile working, which we've actually touched upon some of the issues here today. So there's a lot of relevance on today's episode that are going to feed into next week's episode. So thank you again, panelists. Thank you again, viewers, listeners, and most importantly, everyone take care as we go through these turbulent times. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Bye.
very much. Yeah, bye.
Bye.